Well, no matter where we are from, no matter where we travel, some questions are common to human existence. How do I live a better life? How do we spend time on things that really matter? How do I spend energy on a thing that will last and will make a difference? What does Jesus' kingdom look like? And how do we get in? And by the end of our time together today, I believe that you'll have some new insights into Jesus' answers and his perspectives on some of these questions. Today we're starting this new series of sermons called Living the Beatitudes. So over the next 2 months, we're going to look at Matthew's chapter 5 through 7. This is often called the Sermon on the Mount. But instead of calling it the Sermon on the Mount, some people have called it the Discourse on Discipleship. This is because it describes a lifestyle that's in contrast with the normal way that most humans behave. John Stott, a famous evangelical leader and writer, says, the sermon is probably the best known of the teachings of Jesus. It's also arguably the least understood and certainly the least obeyed. It is Jesus' own description of what he wanted his followers to be and to do. So this sermon by Jesus, again, all of chapters 5 through 7, was given near the beginning of the 3-year process of training his followers. Jesus is starting to change students into teachers, followers into disciples. Notice a few things in these verses that come before the passage. He's near Capernaum, the hometown of Peter and Andrew. He's surrounded by these rolling hills of Galilee. It's an opportunity for the disciples to spend quality time with their leader. Next, he sits down. In Jesus' culture, of course, this is normal teaching position. It shows that an important lesson is coming. And lastly, his main audience is the disciples. It's not the general crowd. You are a similar audience today. You're people who have decided to give up precious time on a holiday weekend to learn more about Jesus. Although, let me be clear, if you're a person here today who still has doubts about Jesus and his teachings, you're still very welcome here. So seated on this hill, Jesus gives the most direct teachings of his entire ministry about discovering true joy in life. So let's focus on our text for today, which will be Matthew 5, 1 through 12. What does the word Beatitudes mean to you? Even if English is your first language, like me, you may still not know. I actually had to go find the definition, remind myself what the word means. It's not often used. When I'm sitting around the table with my kids and my wife, we did not use the word Beatitudes during our bike ride yesterday. It's not a very common word. One dictionary said it's a state of great joy. Being blessed, or at least feeling blessed, is often linked to the Beatitude, is what this dictionary said. Another said it's a state of utmost bliss. You know, Luke chapter 6 contains another list of Beatitudes. You can look at it later. There's differences and similarities between these two lists. Matthew lists 9 Beatitudes. Luke only has 4. They were sermons that were preached in different locations. And there's actually slightly different terminology. But Bible scholars are united that these were 2 different sermons given about a year apart. Please raise your hands if you can answer one of these questions, okay? Raise your hand if you can answer one of these questions. How many of you have kids? Raise your hand, okay? Now keep your hands up. How many of you were a kid? I hope all of you raised your hand. And how many of you know that kids need to hear things several times before they remember? Sometimes repeating things is the best way to help a kid learn or a disciple learn. And so I'm grateful and not totally surprised that Jesus repeated himself to his disciples and helped them learn. One of my favorite classes in seminary was by an older professor who spent weeks showing us how the Old Testament words and concepts are connected to hundreds of Jesus' actions and teachings. One of my favorite passages is Luke 24 that we won't look at, but it's where Jesus appears on the road, walks alongside some startled and shocked disciples, and then says that beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. For example, in Jesus' ministry, we see parallels between the three problems that the Israelites faced during the Exodus as they traveled for 40 years from Egypt to the Promised Land. And we see three temptations that Jesus, a boy who grew up in Egypt, faces in the wilderness during 40 days as he starts his ministry in the previous chapters. And throughout Jesus' ministry, he intentionally does things and says things that are linked to the Old Testament. So now think about Mount Sinai, where the Ten Commandments were given to Moses. And in today's verses, Jesus chooses to go up on a mountain to deliver his key teachings, including 9 Beatitudes. In fact, later in the chapter, Jesus refers to some of the 10 Commandments given by Moses and says, "But I'm telling you. But I'm telling you." So we need to pay attention as Jesus expands and goes beyond the 10 Commandments with his invitation to live in a way that most humans can't imagine. If you take away nothing from today, please remember this, that the Beatitudes are more than statements about Christian ethics. They're not defining what we get if we act in a certain way necessarily. Instead, these are identity statements. Let me say it again. The Beatitudes are identity statements about who we are as Jesus' followers. Instead of commanding us, Jesus inspires and invites us to a different way of living. And as part of my preparation for this sermon, I had the joy of listening to a series of sermons from preachers around the world who attended a multicultural worship conference this spring. One pastor from Africa said the Beatitudes are not simply naive spiritual things to do and to score points in heaven. Instead, these are ways to defy the forces of evil in this world. These are ways that Christians can be identified and how we draw people to following Christ. Amen? Let's look at 2 key words that are used repeatedly in these verses and are often misunderstood: blessed and righteousness. What is the meaning of blessed? It's a little different than blessing. The word used for blessed is Makarios. But if I say Makarios is Alfonso, or Makarios is Hijung, or Makarios is Paul, it gives the idea that someone doesn't necessarily feel happy, but that they're joyous and fulfilled no matter the situation. They're content. According to Reverend Jerry Pillay, a South African of Indian descent, it's a commendation, it's a sense of congratulations to a person. There's a different Greek word for blessed, and so instead the Beatitudes are descriptions and commendations of the good life and what Jesus desired for believers. So we often say blessed to try to get that difference in English. But you could also say, congratulations are you who mourn, or contented are you who are meek. One of my favorite books, Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, says that the word in Hebrew, or the equivalent in Greek, this Makarios, they're word clusters which are not part of a wish. They do not invoke a blessing. Rather, they recognize an existing state of happiness or good fortune. They affirm a quality of spirituality that is already present. So because of this emphasis and because we're not talking about an action of blessing, most people say blessed, and the Beatitudes do not mean that blessed are all the people who do X because they will receive Y. This is not a transaction where if you do something, then God will automatically give you something. Instead, they should be read with the sense that if you do X or you are X, then you're in a good place. We use sayings in my culture to capture this, like, my life has really come together, or life has been good to me. I'll give you a practical example. We could say, blessed is the joyful daughter of Mr. Kim because she will inherit the Kim's business. The woman we're talking about is already joyful or content, a daughter of Mr. Kim, and she's not working to earn the business. Everyone knows that a key part of her fulfilling and secure life is that she and the community around her know that the business will one day be hers. So the word blessed means there is both a good situation that already exists and a future that allows her to live her full life right now. The second key word, which we see repeated in verses 6 and 10 and other places in the coming chapters, is righteousness. But what does that mean? I grew up in a small church in Hood River that had good Bible teaching, and my parents did a great job helping me understand the scriptures. But it wasn't until I was about 24 years old that I understood the power and the depth of this word and why it occurs throughout the Bible. I thought that a righteous person was good at following the rules or obeying the high standards of a faith community. If I called you righteous, I thought it meant that I admired your personal life and respected your good, holy behavior. However, understanding the real definition of righteousness changed several things for me. I stopped thinking it was something impossible to achieve. It meant I started paying more attention to the thousands of verses that use this word in the Bible instead of skipping past them. Righteousness is the Greek word dikaiosune, and this word does not really talk about ideal ethical standards, but it's all about proper relationships. Proper relationships. You know, like a diamond has many sides, the Bible uses this word to describe several ideas of what relationships we're talking about. It's a holistic word that contains concepts about justice, mercy, and faithfulness. I'll give you some examples. Righteousness describes the mighty acts of God in history to save. If you look in Micah 6 later, Micah 6, 3 through 5, it talks about historic events like coming out of Egypt. And then it says that these things happen so that you may know the righteousness of the Lord. So we're talking about saving acts by a God who's in relationship with his people. And then the phrase affirmed as righteous appears in Isaiah 54, verses 10 through 17 and other places. And it conveys affirmed as righteous is a new status of our relationship to God. And then in Job 29, 14 through 16, he says, I put on righteousness, and I helped the blind, the lame, the poor, and I did justice. And so it's a human response in a relationship to other humans in need. Lastly, righteousness in some scriptures is closely related to a peace or a good relationship with everything around you. And you can see that in Isaiah 32, 17 through 20 and other places. So as you use these words, blessed and righteousness in the coming weeks, please remember, blessed refers to a spiritual condition of divinely gifted joy that's already present, not a requirement to be fulfilled in order to receive a reward. And righteousness means that having flourishing relationships the way God designed them, not just a sense of holiness or perfection that I grew up thinking about. In the time we have left, I want to look at 3 of the 9 Beatitudes, and we'll pay special attention to these ones because as I prayed about it, I felt God telling me they're really important for our multicultural community. Being poor in spirit, being meek, and having purity of heart. So blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, in verse 3. The parallel verses in Luke, by the way, say that blessed are the poor. And so many people sometimes think these verses talk about people who don't have much money, don't have many possessions. And while it's true that other Bible verses talk about that idea and how God loves the people who are not rich, not privileged, remember that Jesus says he came to fulfill what the prophets talked about. And so I look at Isaiah, who uses the same word that's translated poor. He uses it a lot. And on rare occasions, the word poor refers to people who don't have enough to eat, like in Isaiah 58:7, but usually it describes a humble person who knows he or she needs God's grace and trembles at his word, like in Isaiah 66, verse 2. But what does being poor in spirit look like in Oregon today? You know, in the USA, one value that's often repeated to kids is if you work hard, you can get anything you want and you can be anything you want to be. There's a saying in my culture that you should pull yourself up by your bootstraps. In other words, lift yourself up by your own shoelaces. And we feel the need to perform and to be proud of our achievements, whether in our careers or in our spiritual lives. But being poor in spirit is the opposite. Have you read the Bible in a year? Do you know how to do an inductive Bible study? Do you pray for 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 3 hours each day? These things are great. But how do you talk about these things with other people? How do they help you understand your own sin, your own shortcomings? When you finish these spiritual achievements, how do they increase your dependence on God? You or I are poor in spirit when we realize we have nothing to be proud of spiritually. In the words of one writer, being poor in spirit is about spiritual bankruptcy before God. When we become humble and when we're aware of our shortcomings, that's what we're talking about. Our identity is poor in spirit when we understand that the kingdom of heaven, and the kingdom of heaven throughout the Bible, is a way of living under Jesus' leadership. And so when we have kingdom behaviors and attitudes, self-sufficiency is not the most important thing, and promoting ourselves is not needed. I'll give you an example. I think of many of our village kids volunteers who hold major responsibilities during the work week, and yet they work together to humbly help kids do crafts and have fun. And in particular, I think about a Stanford University graduate who is now a senior leader in a major technology company after decades of working there, but he gladly helps clean up glitter and help kids use scissors in a safe way. So for me, I want to pause and ask, who in my life is clearly depending on God and depending on others in their community? Think about times when you felt the need for God the most. What can you learn from those times? Next, I want to focus on blessed are the meek, but let me quickly touch on verse 4. Verse 4 says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." And yes, mourning can include being sad over a devastating divorce or losing a job or fights in our family, but it's more than that. What prevents you from offering comfort to others? What distractions prevent us from mourning alongside others? How can we become a community that grieves for the ungodly character that's underneath bad situations? This week, I've been thinking about my need to mourn the evil greed, the desire for control, the pride I see in people who have power. For example, greed, control, and pride are behind most wars and conflicts. And these hurt innocent people. And I personally mourn for the almost 100,000 people around the world who have been forced to flee their homes. This is an all-time high from what I'm reading. That's like everyone living in California, Texas, Michigan, and Florida being forced to move. How do we mourn for anyone who suffers and not become insensitive or try to shield ourselves from the pain? I think part of it is mourning the sin inside ourselves. And since I certainly have greed, control issues, and pride inside me, it touched me deeply this week. But the good news is that even in the midst of our mourning, because we're mourning the right things that Jesus teaches about, we can be comforted as we remember how Jesus experienced and conquered similar things. He provides forgiveness, he provides an answer for each one, as well as a community that can walk together in difficult times. But let's move on to verse 5. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. So in a multicultural, multi-generational church, meekness seems especially important. So I'm going to spend a little more time on this one. Meekness involves allowing that spiritual poverty or spiritual bankruptcy to change our behavior towards other humans and towards God. The Greek term describes relations between people, and our identity as a meek person means that we submit to God's ways, but it can result in surprising actions. The Greek philosopher Aristotle uses the same Greek word in a book written about 3 centuries before Jesus, And he talks about meekness as the virtue of acting halfway between recklessness on the one side and cowardice on the other. For Aristotle, the one who's truly meek is the one who becomes angry on the right grounds, against the right person, in the right manner, at the right moment, and for the right length of time. Meekness doesn't mean being passive, is the short way to say it. One commentator says that the Hebrew or Aramaic word Jesus uses for meek describes hardworking farmers and strong yet gentle farm animals like horses and oxen and cows. It describes a faithful person who has the power of free will but chooses to follow God's will without hesitation or resentment. And a final insight into the meek, who are the meek, it comes from considering that last phrase, who will inherit the earth? Ken Bailey, who spent 40 years living in the Middle East, says that Jesus' original audience no doubt heard Jesus talking about the earth many times. In the Bible, the word for the earth is used, it's about 2,000 times, and it refers to several different things. Sometimes it refers to the land in general, sometimes the promised land for Israel, or sometimes just the inhabited earth. In other words, many of the original listeners who wanted to overthrow the Romans, control their own land, would have been shocked by Jesus' words. Who will inherit the land? The answer was the meek, not a certain race, not the descendants of a specific people or the people called the zealots who were advocating for a violent uprising to control the promised land. The meek have the rights of inheritance, not the violent, not the members of that tribe, of any tribe. So as people in the church then read Matthew's words in later generations, they likely thought about some of the other definitions of the whole earth. They saw it as a precious inheritance for the children of God who will care for the earth and live in harmony with it. But in both cases, Jesus challenges our assumptions of who will control the land. When I think of this idea of meekness, I think of one of my closest friends during the 7 years I lived in India. I'll call him Santosh to protect his identity. He grew up in South India, loved his family, loved his food. He was the leader of his gang of friends, had a great sense of humor, and he didn't have a fancy education, didn't have job titles. When he heard about the fact that many villages in North India have no church, and some people literally have never heard the word Jesus, he obeyed God's call to love all people, and for him, that meant he moved. So now he lives in a completely different culture from his own. When churches around him in the last few years have been burned down, he goes to the police station and the government offices. He humbly asks for justice. He visits sick people, does things that are uncomfortable for him because he's embraced meekness. Do you know someone who's humble yet strong? How can we support those who follow Jesus no matter the cost? How can we become a person like that? Well, next is verse 6, and we won't spend much time on this, but as you ponder your identity as somebody who hungers and thirsts for righteousness, remember that definition of righteousness and how we can pursue relationships that are filled with justice and respect with God, with others, with creation. These right relationships lead to flourishing. They lead to a sense of full life. And the people sitting around Jesus when he first spoke those words lived in a world where food was scarce and travel was difficult. So do we pursue good relationships with the urgency of someone who's truly thirsty and hungry in that kind of world? So blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy, in verse 7. Again, we won't spend much time on this, but what makes mercy possible? I'd suggest it's directly related to forgiving and to being forgiven. To show mercy is extremely difficult if you're sitting across from someone who's wronged you, but understanding how you've been forgiven does make it possible. And of course, the alternative, self-destruction through nursing grudges or seeking revenge. So are we more merciful today than we were a year ago? Is our community giving more grace towards people who don't deserve it than a year ago? Well, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God, says verse 8. And this is the last beatitude we'll focus on. Jesus was viewed as a rabbi in his day and the fulfillment of the prophets. And so purity in his culture was mostly focused on literally making your skin clean before you worshiped God. Think about Psalm 24, verses 3 through 4, which says, "The one who has clean hands and a pure heart will see God." Jesus wasn't critical of the rules that were being developed by other rabbis about ceremonial purity here, but he did decide to place his entire emphasis on purity of the heart. So in my house, if I say to my daughters or my sons or my wife, "Is your heart broken?" If I say, "Yeah, is your heart broken?" the word heart means we're mainly talking about someone's feelings. But the word heart in the mind of any Jewish person listening to Jesus' words was defined differently. The word heart means the entire interior life of the person. The feelings and the mind and the will were all part of this word, the heart. And so our identity then is to be people who demonstrate purity in all these aspects of our interior world. So what is purity? What is purity of heart? Is it perfect living? Is it being clean in our thoughts, being clean in our jokes, being clean in all of our different behaviors? Yes, but that's an incomplete understanding of purity. Because we must remember that something pure is something that's concentrated, a concentrated substance that's been refined. Some of you love essential oils. The best ones, I'm told by my wife, are not just pure in the sense of being clean and filtered, but they're concentrated, they're refined. And I love what pastor, author, and speaker Mandy Smith from Australia says about purity and refinement. She says that Jesus was not swayed by those who opposed him. He had collisions with worldly systems and expectations each day. He had collisions with politics. He'd go back to the Father. Who do you say I am? What is the kingdom? So being refined means that we'll be asked to give away things we don't want to give away, to sacrifice. Jesus died many deaths and sacrificed many times before the cross. He died to comfort, to stability, and so much more. And so when we strive for this kind of purity in our feelings, our mind, our will, then it's natural that we will see God. We may not see him with our actual eyes, but we will see where he is working. We'll see where he's working in the world around us. We'll see how he's speaking to us through the Bible verses we read, through the words of another Jesus follower who speaks to us that week. You will see God in your prayer times when you pay attention to the thoughts he puts in your head. Seeing God is really about a knowledge of God, a vision of him, and these are privileges that are given to the angels, but they're also given to the pure in heart. When I think of the pure in heart, I think of a servant leader like the vice president I worked for at Nike. By his early 20s, he'd had a PhD from a university in London, and soon he was managing an annual budget of $400 million a year. He was in Ethiopia helping the British government help the marginalized, the forgotten. For a while, he was chief of staff to the British Secretary of State, yet he was willing to take the blame when something went wrong on our team at Nike, when the Nike leadership was upset. He was willing to go to lunch with any staff member. He would ask himself in my presence what was best for his team, what was the right thing to do so that his staff would feel, think, know they were appreciated, what was the right risk to take so that Jesus' care for those around him would be seen. So do you have people around you who can help you examine your behaviors, reflect on your motives? Do we have that daily routine for self-reflection and sacrificing anything that doesn't draw us closer to Jesus? Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God, is verse 9. It deserves a whole sermon. I'll just say that the Bible is not talking about peacekeepers. It's talking about peacemakers, people who actively try to reconcile. And reconciliation is a huge theme throughout Jesus' life, throughout God's story. It takes effort. And both passages in Matthew 5 as well as Luke 6 end with words about persecution, which in short tells me that persecution is normal. It's not an exception. And Jesus points out that our identity is people who are persecuted for righteousness. As you'll remember, righteousness involves pursuing right relationships, not just standing up for our opinions. And so while all the Beatitudes so far have not mentioned Jesus, here he's at the center. Legitimate persecution is, quote, because of me. Because of me. And in Luke, he says it's because of the Son of Man. And so Jesus' followers are supposed to be easy to identify because they're poor in spirit, they're meek, they're pure in heart, and all the rest. But ultimately, loyalty to the person of Jesus is our identity. So in conclusion, tomorrow, the United States celebrates its 246th birthday. And in the last few weeks, we have seen tremendous changes in our society. New laws, regulations, public debates. But no matter what happens around us, nor where we end up living in the world, may we remember that Jesus' invitation to live a counter-human life is here in the Beatitudes. And may we live as blessed people who are easily identified as we live in a joyous and contented way. May we be known for our righteousness as we build relationships that are good and flourishing.